Biography of Carl Rogers. He shared his elementary school days in Oak Park, Illinois, with Ernest Hemingway and the children of Frank Lloyd Wright, but he had no aspirations for either literature or for architecture. Instead, he wanted to be a farmer, a scientific farmer who cared about plants and animals and how they grew and developed. Although he was from a large family, he was quite shy and lacking in social skills. A sensitive boy, he was easily hurt by the teasing he received from classmates and siblings. At the beginning of his high school years, his parents, hoping for a more wholesome and religious atmosphere, moved their family to a farm about 45 miles west of Chicago. The move met his parents' purpose. In this isolated atmosphere, the family developed close ties with one another but not with young people from other families. Reading the Bible, working hard, and taking care of farm animals and plants occupied much of his time. Although he believed that his parents cared very much for their children, he also believed that they were quite controlling in their child-rearing practices. As a result, the children grew up in a home that included almost no social life and an abundance of hard work. Dancing, playing cards, drinking carbonated beverages, and attending the theater were all forbidden. In this environment, the young man developed a scientific attitude toward farming, taking detailed notes on his observations. These notes taught him about the necessary and sufficient conditions for the optimal growth of plants and animals. Throughout his high school years and into his college days, he retained a passionate interest in scientific agriculture. However, he never did become a farmer. After 2 years of college, he changed his life goal from agriculture to the ministry and later to psychology. But devotion to the scientific method was to remain with Carl Rogers for a lifetime. And his research on the necessary and sufficient conditions for human psychological growth was at least partially responsible for his winning the first Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award granted by the American Psychological Association. Overview of Client-Centered Theory. Although he is best known as the founder of client-centered therapy, Carl Rogers developed a humanistic theory of personality that grew out of his experiences as a practicing psychotherapist. Unlike Freud, who was primarily a theorist and secondarily a therapist, Rogers was a consummate therapist but only a reluctant theorist. He was more concerned with helping people than with discovering why they behaved as they did. He was more likely to ask, how can I help this person grow and develop, rather than to ponder the question, what caused this person to develop in this manner. Like many personality theorists, Rogers built his theory on the scaffold provided by experiences as a therapist. Unlike most of these other theorists, however, he continually called for empirical research to support both his personality theory and his therapeutic approach. Perhaps more than any other therapist-theorist, Rogers advocated a balance between tender-minded and hard-headed studies that would expand knowledge of how humans feel and think. Even though he formulated a rigorous, internally consistent theory of personality, Rogers did not feel comfortable with the notion of theory. His personal preference was to be a helper of people and not a constructor of theories. To him, theories seemed to make things too cold and external, and he worried that his theory might imply a measure of finality. During the 1950s, at a midpoint in his career, Rogers was invited to write what was then called the Client-Centered Theory of Personality, and his original statement is found in Volume 3 of Sigmund Koch's Psychology, A Study of a Science. Even at that time, Rogers realized that 10 or 20 years hence, his theories would be different, but unfortunately, throughout the intervening years, he never systematically reformulated his theory of personality. Although many of his subsequent experiences altered some of those earlier ideas, his final theory of personality rests on that original foundation spelled out in the Koch series. Carl Ransom Rogers was born on January 8, 1902, in Oak Park, Illinois, the fourth of 6 children born to Walter and Julia Cushing Rogers. Carl was closer to his mother than to his father, who, during the early years, was often away from home working as a civil engineer. Walter and Julia Rogers were both devoutly religious, and Carl became interested in the Bible, reading from it and other books even as a preschool child. From his parents, He also learned the value of hard work, a value that, unlike religion, stayed with him throughout his life. Rogers had intended to become a farmer, and after he graduated from high school, he entered the University of Wisconsin as an agriculture major. However, he soon became less interested in farming and more devoted to religion. By his third year at Wisconsin, Rogers was deeply involved with religious activities on campus and spent 6 months traveling to China to attend a student religious conference. This trip made a lasting impression on Rogers. The interaction with other young religious leaders changed him into a more liberal thinker and moved him toward independence from the religious views of his parents. These experiences with his fellow leaders also gave him more self-confidence in social relationships. Unfortunately, he returned from the journey with an ulcer. Although his illness prevented him from immediately going back to the university, it did not keep him from working. He spent a year recuperating by laboring on the farm and at a local lumber yard before eventually returning to Wisconsin. There, he joined a fraternity, displayed more self-confidence, and in general, was a changed student from his pre-China days. In 1924, Rogers entered the Union Theological Seminary in New York with the intention of becoming a minister. While at the seminary, he enrolled in several psychology and education courses at neighboring Columbia University. He was influenced by the progressive education movement of John Dewey, which was then strong at Teachers College, Columbia. Gradually, Rogers became disenchanted with the doctrinaire attitude of religious work. Even though Union Theological Seminary was quite liberal, Rogers decided that he did not wish to express a fixed set of beliefs but desired more freedom to explore new ideas. Finally, in the fall of 1926, he left the seminary to attend Teachers College on a full-time basis with a major in clinical and educational psychology. From that point on, he never returned to formal religion. His life would now take a new direction toward psychology and education. In 1927, Rogers served as a fellow at the New Institute for Child Guidance in New York City and continued to work there while completing his doctoral degree. At the institute, he gained an elementary knowledge of Freudian psychoanalysis, but he was not much influenced by it, even though he tried it out in his practice. He also attended a lecture by Alfred Adler, who shocked Rogers and the other staff members with his contention that an elaborate case history was unnecessary for psychotherapy. Rogers received a PhD from Columbia in 1931 after having already moved to New York to work with the Rochester Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. During the early phase of his professional career, Rogers was strongly influenced by the ideas of Otto Rank, who had been one of Freud's closest associates before his dismissal from Freud's inner circle. In 1936, Rogers invited Rank to Rochester for a 3-day seminar to present his new post-Freudian practice of psychotherapy. Rank's lectures provided Rogers with the notion that therapy is an emotional growth-producing relationship, nurtured by the therapist's empathic listening and unconditional acceptance of the client. Rogers spent 12 years at Rochester, working at a job that might easily have isolated him from a successful academic career. He had harbored a desire to teach in a university after a rewarding teaching experience during the summer of 1935 at Teachers College and after having taught courses in sociology at the University of Rochester. During this period, he wrote his first book, The Clinical Treatment of the Problem Child, the publication of which led to a teaching offer from Ohio State University. Despite his fondness for teaching, he might have turned down the offer if his wife had not urged him to accept and if Ohio State had not agreed to start him at the top, with the academic rank of full professor. In 1940, at the age of 38, Rogers moved to Columbus to begin a new career. Pressed by his graduate students at Ohio State, Rogers gradually conceptualized his own ideas on psychotherapy, not intending them to be unique and certainly not controversial. These ideas were put forth in Counseling and Psychotherapy, published in 1942. In this book, which was a reaction to the older approaches to therapy, Rogers minimized the causes of disturbances and the identification and labeling of disorders. Instead, he emphasized the importance of growth within the patient, called by Rogers the client. In 1944, as part of the war effort, Rogers moved back to New York as Director of Counseling Services for the United Services Organization. After 1 year, he took a position at the University of Chicago, where he established a counseling center and was allowed more freedom to do research on the process and outcome of psychotherapy. The years 1945 to 1957 at Chicago were the most productive and creative of his career. His therapy evolved from one that emphasized methodology, or what in the early 1940s was called the non-directive technique, to one in which the sole emphasis was on the client-therapist relationship. Always the scientist, Rogers, along with his students and colleagues, produced groundbreaking research on the process and effectiveness of psychotherapy. Wanting to expand his research and his ideas to psychiatry, Rogers accepted a position at the University of Wisconsin in 1957. However, he was frustrated with his stay at Wisconsin because he was unable to unite the professions of psychiatry and psychology, and because he felt that some members of his own research staff had engaged in dishonest and unethical behavior. Disappointed with his job at Wisconsin, Rogers moved to California, where he joined the Western Behavioral Sciences Institute, WBSI, and became increasingly interested in encounter groups. Rogers resigned from WBSI when he felt it was becoming less democratic, and along with about 75 others from the institute, formed the Center for Studies of the Person. He continued to work with encounter groups but extended his person-centered methods to education, including the training of physicians, and to international politics. During the last years of his life, he led workshops in such countries as Hungary, Brazil, South Africa, and the former Soviet Union. He died February 4, 1987, following surgery for a broken hip. The personal life of Carl Rogers was marked by change and openness to experience. As an adolescent, he was extremely shy, had no close friends, and was socially incompetent in any but superficial contacts. He did, however, have an active fantasy life, which he later believed would have been diagnosed as schizoid. His shyness and social ineptitude greatly restricted his experiences with women. When he originally entered the University of Wisconsin, he had only enough courage to ask out a young lady whom he had known in elementary school in Oak Park, Helen Elliott. Helen and Carl were married in 1924 and had 2 children, David and Natalie. Despite his early problems with interpersonal relationships, Rogers grew to become a leading proponent of the notion that the interpersonal relationship between 2 individuals is a powerful ingredient that cultivates psychological growth within both persons. However, the transition was not easy. He abandoned the formalized religion of his parents, gradually shaping a humanistic/existential philosophy that he hoped would bridge the gap between Eastern and Western thought. Rogers received many honors during his long professional life. He was the first president of the American Association for Applied Psychology and helped bring that organization and the American Psychological Association, APA, back together. He served as president of APA for the year 1946 to 1947 and served as first president of the American Academy of Psychotherapists. In 1956, he was co-winner of the first Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award presented by APA. This award was especially satisfying to Rogers because it highlighted his skill as a researcher, a skill he learned well as a farm boy in Illinois. Rogers originally saw little need for a theory of personality. But under pressure from others and also to satisfy an inner need to be able to explain the phenomena he was observing, he evolved his own theory, which was first tentatively expressed in his APA presidential address. His theory was more fully espoused in Client-Centered Therapy, 1951, and was expressed in even greater detail in the Cook series. However, Rogers always insisted that the theory should remain tentative, and it is with this thought that one should approach a discussion of Roge-Ryan personality theory.